Our first speaker is Colleen Orrick, and she's going to share about her experiences as a sister of an institutional survivor.
You can see a picture of my brother Gerry there. He's holding a little guinea pig that was taken in an institution and sent to my parents. The institution used it in their brochures, and I don't know if advertising is the right word, but that kind of thing. He was a pretty cute little guy. For my presentation, I'm going to draw on a major research paper that I wrote called Valuing Gerry, Life Writing, and People with Developmental Disabilities. I wrote the paper in partial fulfillment for the requirements for the MA in Critical Disability Studies at York. Because Gerry lived at home until he was 5 years old, he was a well-known and beloved sibling when he was placed in an institution. And because I'm 5 years older than him, I remember a lot about his life at home and have since come to understand some things about his life away from home. We maintained a bond throughout our adult lives, and his influence on me is profound. Understanding and integrating Gerry's placement in an institution, its impact on our family, and its impact on Gerry has been a major life task. I believe that the major factor that impacted him, and therefore his family, was not Down syndrome, but the way society responded to Down syndrome. And because of that social attitude, we were robbed as a family, and he was so much more than robbed as a person. I like to focus on stories as a way of knowing. Is anybody familiar with John McKnight? Ever heard of John McKnight? No? Okay, well, he's a community developer, and wonderful writings. If you ever see anything written by John McKnight, snap it up. He talks about stories as a way of knowing and stories as a way of building community. He talks about communities of capacity, and that's what I want to focus on, that type of storytelling. So I'm going to tell you 4 stories about my brother Gerard that I hope illustrate themes about institutionalization of a sibling. So the first one is the story about Gerry moving away, and I call it Breaking the Bonds because that's what the purpose of the institution was at that point. So one night when I was about 10 years old, my mother was tucking me in for the night, and she told me that Gerry would be going away to school. Well, when I was 10 years old, I liked to read a lot, and I immediately went, oh, boarding school, can I go? And she explained to me that, no, it's only for kids like Gerry, and my question was, what do you mean, kids like Gerry? What is that? I don't remember the day that he left. I've racked my brains trying to remember that, and I don't remember it. I think they probably were up and gone before the kids even got up because we lived in Hamilton, and he was going to what was then called Cedar Springs, but was then later called Southwestern Regional Center. So it was a long drive, and they probably were up very early before the rest of the kids got up for school. My parents were both involved in the local association for retarded children, I'll use those air quotes, which is what it was called back then. Over time, most of those associations grew into community living. But at the time in the 1950s and 60s, it was called the Association for Retarded Children. And we knew other families who had children with disabilities, so some of them lived at home and some didn't. So it wasn't completely foreign to us that a sibling could be living away from home. My parents worked really hard to keep our family connected. I think my mother probably never recovered from having to place Gerry in an institution. So she lobbied really hard throughout his whole life to get him closer to her. And my parents helped other families either place children in institutions or keep children at home. there was a time in the 50s and 60s where they were doing both, supporting people in institutions and supporting people in communities. So Madeline mentioned Cedar Springs or Southwestern Regional. The parents' groups actually lobbied the government to cut in half the number of beds they were building in that institution, and they were successful. So I'm not sure if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, and I don't have it written down, but I think it was originally intended to have 2,400 children and adults living there, and they lobbied it down to about 1,200, which is still humongous. But, so the parents were involved in both supporting people with children in institutions and building resources in the communities to support people. My parents worked really hard to keep our family connected to Gerry. So we would go on trips down to Chatham to visit him, and they were a really big deal. Sometimes we got to stay in a hotel. We ate in restaurants. There was a beach not far away, as Madeline showed you in the photograph, and we had wonderful days at the beach. I can remember my dad you could rent inner tubes, like from trucks and things like that. And so my dad rented inner tubes for us, and we were, bobbing around in the water with these inner tubes, and it was a great, great day. We still remember it fondly. Gerry came home for holidays and Christmas and summertime and those kind of things. So I still had a connection with him, and I didn't know everything about his life like I do with my other brothers, but we still were connected with him, and he was still part of our family, and our neighbors knew him and our friends knew him and that kind of thing. So when I think back, I think he almost led a double life. Sometimes he was in an institution and sometimes he was in a family. At the same time that Gerry was placed in the institution, I can remember going with my dad to Huronia and as a representative of the Hamilton Association for Retarded Children. And they would bring up, I remember the time that I went with them that I'm thinking of, they brought a huge box of secondhand clothes to distribute to the people that live there. They brought cigarettes, which apparently were was sort of like an underground economy. And I remember saying to my dad, I think I was only about probably 10 to 12 in there somewhere, and I remember saying to my dad, if they can figure out how to make an underground economy with cigarettes, what are they doing in there? The survival skills that people had were amazing, I think. So I remember the early days of this parents' movement. They had meetings in my family's living room. And I remember the sort of duality of having a brother in an institution, but my parents working to build community resources. My dad told me that one of the reasons they placed Gerry in an institution was because that was the only way he was going to get to go to school. And yet my dad sat on the administration board for what were eventually 3 schools that the Hamilton Association built and maintained in Hamilton. But Gerry wouldn't have been allowed to go to those schools. So it was interesting times, and it was difficult in the sense that we missed him. We missed him a lot. Another story that I wanted to tell you was about a time when, I call it, I only have 2 brothers, actually 3, usurping the role of family. The institution began to take the place of our family. This takes place when I was in my teens, and I remember I had met a new friend, somebody new, and I don't remember who it was or anything like that, but I just remember them asking me if I had any brothers or sisters, and me just telling them, oh, I have 2 brothers. And my mother overheard this, so when this friend left, she asked me, was I ashamed of Gerry? And I was shocked that she said that. And I said, no, I'm just tired of explaining. So by that point, I knew that there was something different. So even though, as I explained before, we knew other families that had children in institutions, other families that had children with developmental disabilities who stayed at home, I realized by this point that that was unusual, and I just didn't want to explain it to everybody. I've really thought about whether I was ashamed of him, and I thought, no, I really don't think I am. I think I'm just tired of explaining to everybody. So when Gerry was, had been at Cedar Springs for a few years, thanks to my mother's lobbying, he moved to Midwestern Regional Center, which is up near Listowel. Is it north of Kitchener? So, in that area. It's a much smaller institution, and it was only for children. I think Gerry probably had a relatively good time there. He made a couple of friends, and they were kind of infamous. They called them the Three Musketeers, and if one was in trouble, they were all in trouble, and if one was having a good time, they were all having a good time. So he formed those bonds, and he must have been playing a lot of sports, because I can remember my parents taking up sports equipment for him, skis and skates and a bicycle and things like that. And they nicknamed him Rocket O'Grady because he was good at hockey, I guess. There used to be a hockey player named Rocket Richard. So he seemed to really do well there in terms of making friends and doing things. And he did go to school, and he did learn to read and write. So but this institution was only for children. And so when he got to be about 18, 19, they started telling my parents that he had to move because he couldn't be there past the age of 21. So just picture this, your home where you put down some roots and had lots of fun things to do, tells you, oh, just because of the age that you are, you have to move. So my mother continued lobbying to get him closer to Hamilton, and she was successful in that they moved him to a Schedule II institution called Bethesda. And I think that move was probably life-defining for Gerry. When he first moved there, my mother was quite distressed because they didn't have him doing all the fun things that he'd been doing at Midwestern, and they said, well, he doesn't want to do them. One of the things that Gerry loved to do was swim. He loved to be in water, and he refused to go in the pool there. He wouldn't do any of that. And my mother was really upset and saying, because they did a reassessment of him and told her that he was profoundly retarded or something like that. And she said, they don't know him. When I look back on that time now, I think he was grieving, seriously grieving, and nobody recognized it. He'd lost contact with his two friends, the other two musketeers. Every relationship he had, except that of that with his family, was gone. Nobody recognized that grief. They just, tried to give him programs to do that he might participate in that were not very challenging for him. I got a phone call from my mother a few years on when Gerry was at Bethesda telling me that he wouldn't go in the bathroom and he was holding his urine, and it had been 3 days since he'd urinated. And I said to her, Mom, you make them take him to a hospital. He's going to damage his kidneys. You need to get him to a hospital right now. So she did. They did get him to a hospital. We knew then that there was something really wrong, something really not good had happened to him. He refused to go in bathrooms. He refused to let people groom him or touch him. He wouldn't let them help him with any hygiene routines. He was doing things like this that he'd never done before, sort of that self-stimming kind of thing. He'd never done that before. He started doing that. So my mother went to see about what was going on and talked to the administration at the institution. And they said, oh, the psychologist said, we'll put him on antidepressants. And my mother didn't like that. So they said, well, this is what the psychiatrist said, and we have lots of people, don't worry, we have lots of people on antidepressants. And my mother said, well, don't you wonder why? Which I thought was kind of a brilliant response to that. So she insisted that they take him for a second opinion. And there was a psychiatrist that had been part of the early part of the parents' movement. He had supported parents to start the parents' movement. And I think his name was Dr. Diamond. My mother's gone, so I can't ask her, but I think it was a Dr. Diamond. And he was in London. And so she got them to take him there. My mother went with them. Gerry wouldn't get out of the car. He wouldn't go. So the psychiatrist came to the car and talked to him. And he diagnosed him with a reactive psychosis and gave him some medication that did help. Reactive psychosis, as I understand it, and believe me, I'm not a psychiatrist, is a short, it usually has a short duration, but Gerry had it for the rest of his life. I strongly suspect that he was assaulted in a bathroom. We have no evidence of that other than his behavior. Nothing we could do about it. I consulted a lawyer, and he said unless we had evidence, it wouldn't go anywhere. And the only evidence we had was Gerry's behavior, and he couldn't tell us what happened to him. So another, divorced from this, my mother had a connection with a social worker that worked at Bethesda, and there was a scandal that the psychiatrist there had been accused of sexually assaulting someone, and the social worker told my mother about that, and that the psychiatrist was just going to move to another institution. And my mother said to the social worker, then the next time he hurts someone, it's on your hands. So we strongly suspected that Gerry had been assaulted, and probably sexually assaulted in a bathroom, but we could never prove it. We didn't see marks on him or anything. He couldn't tell us. And as a sister, I have to tell you that was one of the hardest things for me, was to not be able to comfort him. Eventually, under the umbrella of the institution, Gerry moved to what they called a family home program, where it's kind of like a fostering situation, but you have adults fostered with a family. And the first family that he was at, let's just say it didn't work out very well. But the second family that he lived with, they were wonderful. He still was not letting people touch him or groom him or anything like that. And Paul, the man in the family that he lived with, was able to tap into Gerry's sense of humor and his love of Coke, and get him to start letting him help with his hygiene routines. And they joked around with each other. Because Paul had a beard, Gerry used to call him Grandpa, and thought that was very funny. And he landed in a really good place. I had been lobbying my parents to see if they could move him to one of the L'Arche homes in Hamilton, but for some reason they were opposed to that. I could never figure that out. But he did end up with a really great place. They were wonderful. And they had a farm, and Gerry loved animals. So he had all the dogs and rabbits and goats and chickens that he could want, and he was a member of their family. They just took him in as a member of their family. So he had about 10 years with them, and it was really, really good. A little funny thing that happened, their last name was McDonald, and so one summer, they lived near a beach, so one summer we rented a cottage not far from where they were, and brought Gerry to the cottage with us, and thought that he might have a nice time there, and he sort of did, but he wouldn't do anything. Like, he wouldn't go to the beach. He didn't want me to put my feet in the water for some reason. He would pull me back. Anyway, I said to him one day, do you want to go to McDonald's? And I meant the home, like, do you want to go back to McDonald's? And he was all excited. He goes, yeah. So I figured out later that he thought I meant the restaurant. But when we did take him back to McDonald's, you could tell that they were really glad to see him, and he was really glad to see them. So when Gerry was about 51, he fell down some stairs at their home, and he had a massive brain bleed. He was put on life support, and eventually we had to turn off the life support for him and let him go. I think my fourth theme that I wanted to discuss is just that we were robbed. As a family, we were robbed of Gerry. And he was robbed of us, and so much more. Just to end on a more upbeat note, the summer that we had the cottage, we had taken Gerry into town to go shopping, and he loved to shop at Giant Tiger. And he stopped as we were going through the door, and he started reading the store's opening hours. So Monday, 6, whatever it was, 6 to 9, and Tuesday, 5 to 10. And as I heard him reading that, I thought, he's okay. For the first time in many years, he's okay. Because he stopped reading about the time that we thought he was assaulted. So when he started reading again, I knew that he was going to be okay. And he was. So that's, I hope I haven't overdone my time, but is that Gerry's candle?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Colleen.